Hello, my name is Danette Bell-vassar, and this is my presentation on the components of blood. So, I'm going to be going over what the different major components that make up our blood is. Going to talk about blood as a whole first, and then break it down into each of its major components, which include red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. So let's jump on in and talk about blood. So, what is it? Why do we need it? First off, it is a fluid that flows through the heart and the blood vessels of our body, the arteries, veins, and capillaries, and we need our blood for transport. It carries oxygen and nutrients to all of our cells and carries carbon dioxide and other waste materials away from the cells to be eliminated. So that trade off happens in the capillaries of the lungs and then in the capillaries near the cells. In the lungs, the blood can pick up oxygen and that our cells need in order to do cellular respiration. And then it carries that oxygen to our cells where it picks up those waste products of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide, and other waste materials in the capillaries there near the cells. It can trade that oxygen off for the waste materials, carry those waste materials back to where they need to be processed and eliminated from the body. All right, so blood is important. It is transport to get all sorts of materials where we need it. Kind of like the major highway system traveling through the US. We need it to get things where it needs to go. All right. So the four key components that make up blood are red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. And each of them has a different function and a different, really specialized mechanism by which they work. So, looking at the overall composition of blood, blood is largely made up of plasma, about 55% of it, and red blood cells. That's about 41% of it. The remaining 4% is those white blood cells and platelets. A small percentage, but really crucial portion that you find in what is known as the buffy coat, because it's sort of this beige layer that you see in between the plasma and the red blood cells when you centrifuge blood to separate it out into its components. So, we're going to start with red blood cells and work our way through these different components of blood. So, first off, looking at red blood cells, also called erythrocytes. These are made in the bone marrow. Most of the blood cells are. Red blood cells generally last for roughly 4 months, 120 days. And we are constantly making new ones. So as they go through their life cycle, which we'll talk about in a second, they are constantly being replaced. Now, most red blood cells have a biconcave shape. That means they curve in the middle on both sides. Kind of like a donut, but that doesn't have a hole in the middle. Now, the interesting thing about red blood cells is, unlike virtually any of our other cells, these cells don't have a nucleus or really other organelles. What they do have is hemoglobin. And so they need iron to carry this oxygen around. Anytime that that's not functioning right, whether it's because the cells are misshapen or there's a lack of them, there's an iron deficiency, you're generally going to get some type of anemia, of which there are several different types. There's iron deficiency anemia, there's pernicious anemia, aplastic anemia, hemolytic anemia. And there is also, for example, sickle cell anemia, where the shape of the erythrocytes is sickled instead of this donut shape. So they're not carrying oxygen as well as they should. So, because they're not carrying oxygen as well as they should, anytime you have some kind of anemia, you're generally going to have symptoms like fatigue, tiredness, because your cells don't have the oxygen supply that they need to do cellular respiration as effectively as they should. So, what these cells do is, again, pick up O2 in our lungs. And because of their shape, because of the iron, they're really good at carrying O2. And they carry that to our cells and carry the CO2 and waste materials away from our cells. Now, the life cycle of erythrocytes, as I mentioned, they last roughly about 120 days. And so they kind of have a three-part life cycle: a production, maturity, and destruction phase. And you can see that they kind of go through some, in this diagram, some different levels of erythroblast where they are developing and maturing. And then they finally mature into a full erythrocyte. And then once they get worn out, they get destroyed, recycled, and new blood cells are made in our bone marrow. So we replace these all the time, which is a really good thing, because if we lose blood or donate blood, we want to be able to make more. So we need to be able to make new blood cells. Our second type of blood cell we're going to look at are white blood cells, also known as leukocytes. This tends to be about 2% of your blood, 1 to 2% of your blood, maybe 3. These are a really vital part of our immune system. This is a major part of our body's immune response. They are made up of 3 key types: granulocytes, which are made up of eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils. And then monocytes and lymphocytes. So these white blood cells, key job that they do is fight infections. So they make up, as I said, a small but vital part of your immune system. These neutrophils help fight bacterial and fungal infections. Basophils, not exactly as well known, but they're in the fight too. Eosinophils specifically help fight infections caused by parasites. Monocytes break down and remove foreign organisms and dying cells from our body. So they help keep things cleaned up and help keep a bunch of garbage from building up in our system. And the lymphocytes are really key parts of our immune system. So, because of this wide variety of cell types that fall into the category of white blood cells, they have a wide range of lifespans. Some last for hours, some last for days, even years. So, they are made in the bone marrow, like the red blood cells, but then they are also made in the thymus, the lymph nodes, and the spleen. We tend to find them not only in our blood, but in the lymph tissues. And as I mentioned, lifespan can vary, usually in the range of days, but depending on the type, they can last for years even. Moving on to platelets, also known as thrombocytes, again, made in the bone marrow. They have a lifespan of roughly 9 to 12 days. And their key job is to keep us from bleeding to death if we get injured or cut. So, clotting, controlling bleeding is really key. And as the diagram shows, what happens when there's an injury, the platelets get activated they kind of call other platelets in, and those platelets gather at the site of the injury and form these clots that help seal up the injury and keep us from bleeding. So, having too few platelets is definitely a problem, because that means if you get injured, you don't stop bleeding the way you should. But having too many can also be a problem if your blood is clotting when it doesn't need to, or clots too much in response to an injury. So these platelets are tiny blood cells that help form these clots and keep you from continuing to bleed. And as they kind of spread across the damaged area, by adhesion, they sort of grab onto each other with these little tentacles and hold on to each other to form that plug. And it seems that these sticky tentacles are part of the problem with hemophilia, a bleeding disease where the blood doesn't clot properly. And so someone who gets a cut or a bruise with hemophilia will just keep bleeding. Now, a normal platelet count is about 150 to 450,000 platelets per microliter. And it really does take a blood test to check where you are at. So that is platelets. Last, we're going to talk about plasma. This is the liquid part of the blood. Plasma is about 90 to 92% water. And this is most of the fluid of your blood. It accounts for about 55% of the overall blood volume. And besides water, it also contains a lot of proteins and minerals, hormones, vitamins, things like that. It really has four key important functions. It helps maintain blood pressure and blood volume. It carries these critical proteins for clotting and immunity, the platelets and the white blood cells. It carries electrolytes like sodium and potassium to our muscles so that they can function properly. And it is commonly given to trauma patients and burn and shock patients to keep their blood pressure up. So, plasma donations are a big part of blood donation. Okay. So, those are the four key parts of blood: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. All of them have their own individual roles, and all of them are vitally important. So, depending on what is needed and how it's needed, they can get separated out from each other as needed. The references for each of my diagrams are on the individual slides, and here are my resource references. Hope you enjoyed.